I'm delighted to be here with Ciaran MacGonigal, art historian, former gallery director, and son of one of the most highly regarded 20th century Irish landscape painters, Maurice MacGonigal. So you're very welcome, Ciaran.
Thank you, James.
So the reason why we're here is we have put together a curated sale of paintings and watercolors by Fergus Orion, RHA. And Fergus died in 1989, having had a very prolific career as an artist, but also, as we'll discuss a little bit later, he was also a lecturer in the College of Art. But the reason why we're having the sale is that there's a quantity of work which was left in his studio when he died, and his widow, May, who has since died, obviously, she left everything to be sold for the benefit of the hospice. So Our Lady's Hospice in Harold's Cross and Blackrock and Wicklow will benefit from the sale of this particular auction. But Ciaran, what I was thinking was that I've been in the business for nearly 40 years, and I've known Fergus's work for virtually the entire duration of that time, because there was hardly an Irish art auction that didn't have one or two or three of his paintings. And I've seen them in so many collections when I've done valuations over the years, but yet I knew really very, very little about him. So you knew Fergus, so maybe you'd like to tell us a little bit about him.
He was originally a young Limerick artist, came to Dublin, settled into rooms in the hotel, I think it was called the Grosvenor, opposite Westland Road Station, and then married the daughter of the house. And they had a very happy, very lifelong, engaging relationship. Fergus, I think I said it to you previously, entered the room like a sort of, as my father described it, a miniature Graf Spee, all guns ready for action. And you never knew upon whom his attentions would fall. But he also had that extraordinary energy that drove him all over Europe to paint, all over Connemara. He had, in his marriage, he was very lucky because May supported him in thought and deed. And everything he did and all the pictures he painted were expressions of great interest and curiosity by him, because he had intense curiosity about things. He was, as you know, a calligrapher. He taught me lithography and silkscreen. He taught me how to draw proper lettering the proper way. He had terrific craft, and you see it reflected in a great deal of his paintings in his sense of structure. He taught in the College of Art, and at night he taught night students, and lucky they all were, and we were, and I was, to have had him, because he made you look at things in a particular way, not always the way you'd thought. And he'd say, why are you doing that? Why are you looking at it like that? How about this? And then he had a curious voice, because I think he'd had something called quinsy when he was young and had a throat operation. So it affected his speech patterns, but didn't affect the speed at which he taught and thought. Right. He loved the countryside, any countryside, and he loved going to, say, the Balearic Islands. He loved going down to Connemara. He loved going to Italy. He loved going to the south of France. Not in the grand glamorous places, but his ability to go places, and May acting, and I mean this in the nicest way, as his pack horse, and willingly and happily enabled him to do a lot of things. And they both had extraordinary energy, and you could meet them anywhere. And I remember as a very young student getting off I had gone up to Vinci to see the great home of Leonardo, and I got off the bus, and there in this dreadful Tuscan downpour was Fergus and May under a sort of an awning, having a drink or a tea or coffee, whatever they were having, and invited me in. And I was now soaked and furious. And Fergus said, well, now you've seen it, you can go back on the next bus, because of course the house was a little house. It was a humble house. And, but at the same time, he insisted then, he and May said they were going back anyway down to Florence, and they came down on the bus with me. And I was now absolutely sodden, and they got me absolutely. I got off that bus, and I think I floated all the way to my digs. But they were like that. They were very, very kind. And Fergus, although he could be quite fierce, had many, many devoted friends over the years, like some of the members of the academy were his very great friends.
James Nolan was one of them, wasn't he?
James Nolan was
Yeah.
a particular, I just want to say it, it was a particular one. And James and he were so different. James was, and Kitty, they were so grand and la-di-da, and used to drive Fergus mad in a way. And James knew he was being poked fun at and didn't mind. There were others sensitive souls, who might have minded a bit more, but it was the volume of his work. And he didn't paint a bad picture ever, because his, what would I say, his craft, his sense of craft, his sense of drawing and his structures would have made him sort of, what do I mean? Yeah, he pre-edited, if you like, what he was seeing. And he looked after his brushes and his canvas, or the canvas paper that he liked so much because it was easier for traveling.
Yes.
And he just went at everything the way he wanted to do it. And he did. He really lived his life as he wanted to live it.
Yeah, because that in many ways came across to me when I was looking through the few hundred works from the studio, was that, number one, the variety of locations.
Yeah.
And in particular, what struck me was that there were a fair number of them that were dated in the sort of the early to mid 1950s, and they were in, you said earlier, in the Balearics, they were in Ibiza, Mallorca, but there was also pictures on the mainland in Spain, you know, Girona, Salamanca, Toledo, and then further afield over in the Greek islands. He visited Santorini, Mykonos, Hydra, but the one place that he must have spent a huge amount of time, and possibly in later period, because I think a lot of them were from the 1970s, were done in Venice. And a lot of them were done on quite a big scale. So would he have painted those pictures sort of there, do you think?
There.
Because quite a lot of them were sort of quite, you know, reasonably sized, not as big as the one here behind me, which is one of Connemara, but some of them were quite.
Well, what he would do is he would go to, there were a number of sort of art institutes, including the Guggenheim Institute, through Peggy Guggenheim, and he always went for a place that had landing places where he could sit and paint, and he would simply force his way. And when the Carabinieri would call the Polizia Municipale would come along, he would just look at them and not know. Of course, he knew perfectly well, but he would paint in that way. And I remember him telling me once or twice that he hired a bigger than usual gondola in which to sit and paint as they went along, because he wanted the effect, rather like the way Nathaniel Hone had painted from his yacht or his gondolas, which were slightly bigger, very probably. But that's what fascinated him. And he loved the flickering light on the Venetian Canal. And so to see it, you had to be, in his view, on it.
Yeah.
And he made friends all over the place. And because he was, you know, transparently a very honest man, people liked him. And in the most unprepossessing places he could be found, or unlikely places, or even dangerous places. And I remember once, many years ago, driving up to a little village called Vergemoli. Now, when I say village, that's one house and a restaurant in the mountains above the Massa Rossa. And I went in, and the friends with me tried to get out of the car. They got so alarmed with the driving. I mean, not my driving, but the terrors of the drop. We go in and there's Fergus and May sitting under a tree, munching away. How they got there, he wouldn't tell me. How they proposed to get back, he wouldn't tell me. But this extraordinary place, and there he was. And he would say, now, if you go over the hill, now we're talking about the mountains, the
Yes.
Transalpine range. And if you go to the next village or whatever, there's so-and-so and so-and-so. And I was thinking, well, it's bad enough trying to get back down. I am not going up another ravine.
Further.
But he had great sense of adventure. Nothing daunted him. He'd come in and to anywhere in the world, and he just had that capacity. And he was much loved also by older generations in Roundstone, because he'd walk in and he'd chat away to them, and he'd stand his round, and he'd chat away about anything other than ask them a direct question, because that was going to end up badly. And of course, by not asking the question, it would they were incontinent with secrets, so it would tumble out. Whereas many a distinguished art historian has gone down to Roundstone to try and find things out, and by asking a direct question, who? Oh, never heard of them.
Never heard.
Whereas Fergus knew all about them.
Right.
And
he obviously had a way of easing the information out of them without them even knowing, probably.
Oh, indeed. Oh, we could tickle the eggs out of a hen. And the thing was that he was, and he was formidable. He walked and spoke like an army officer, and he looked at you. I mean, he kind of gray eyes, and he looked at you, and we asked a question. He also had a moustache, and the moustache had a life of its own. And depending on his humor, particularly his sense of jocosity, that moustache seemed to move around his face. And he was always so neatly dressed, and even in the middle of that confounded downpour in Vinci, there he was. I mean, dressed as a hiker, but everything pressed, everything right. Yeah. He was always very neat and tidy. I think I referred to that in my text about the catalogue. And he was that kind of person. And he'd look at you. And one time I came in, I don't know what I'd been doing, and I was fairly dirty and untidy. And he looked me up and down, and he said, yeah, but your shoes are clean. And if your shoes are clean, it's okay. And I said it to my father, and my father said, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But he and my father got on in their way. I have no idea what Fergus thought about politics or about religion. I never heard them. I knew they thought about food and restaurants and wine and art and other artists, and perhaps some of his share colleagues in the RHA.
Yeah.
He wouldn't hold back on those.
Yeah.
But about the other questions, no idea. He could have had any politics, any religion.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I was talking to Tom Ryan, the former president of the RHA, our past president, and he sort of gave me quite a lot of information about Fergus. And one of the things that I found most fascinating was his sort of modus operandi for getting around, because he never owned a car by all accounts.
No.
And himself and May would get the bus from Bird Avenue over as far as Blessington, and then they'd spend 4 or 5 days crossing the Wicklow Mountains over to the coast, staying in hostels or B&B or in camp, in camping, and painting as he went along. But it seems quite remarkable. But what's lovely about most of the work is that he actually identified exactly where he painted. So, there's all sorts of little townlands, that in the normal course of events, somebody walking across, doing some hill walking, wouldn't know necessarily where they were. They'd know in general terms, what area they were in. He had a remarkable knowledge of the Wicklow Mountains, and presumably the same in Connemara. And it also then translates into his travels on the continent. So he was interested in place, but also in what he was seeing. And he was seemed to be very interested in conveying that sort of sense of atmosphere, the rivers, the running water, the cottages, not so much the people though. People are pretty much sort of, they're there, but they're not that important.
He once said to me that he liked, like my father indeed, the implication of looking at landscape, particularly old landscapes where you could see, to quote the Pierce poem, where mountainy man had sown and soon would reap close to the gates of heaven. He liked those kinds of lights where he could see the ridges and the potato ridges or the whatever the thing was in the particular area. And he liked to know townland names. And I remember once being down, I've forgotten why I was in Blessington, but I met him in the post office and he was posting a lot of his stuff back to his house. He sent, because they were of a certain size, so they could be posted under some postage rate. And he did that all over the world, well, certainly all over Europe.
Yeah.
And I once looked at one of his, you have a very nice Santorini little bell tower thing. And I'd seen one like it and I commented to him and he said, do you know what? He said, he said, I think I'll leave that to Jimmy to do. Because James Nolan was very fond of going to Santorini and such places.
Yes.
And he was kind like that. And he didn't want to intrude upon his pals' areas if that was their special thing.
Right.
And then one day I said something to him about Connemara, and he said, he said, Mac paints it all. He said, Mac being my father, obviously. And I said, yeah. And I said it in sort of an offhand way. I really wasn't thinking. And he said, but your Mac doesn't care. Mac's going to do what he's going to do anyway. And I thought, well, there's two obstinate men recognizing each other's intention.
Absolutely.
Well,
and not being too worried about stepping on toes in that.
No, because you couldn't step on my father's toes in that way. You might in other ways, but not that way.
Yeah.
And so he didn't mind. And he was very sensitive to music and to poetry. And he listened a great deal to people like Mendelssohn and Hindemith. The Hindemith one always, I could understand the Mendelssohn, but the Hindemith and people like that. And then one day he met my mother, and I had been shopping for her in Moran's, which was a record shop in Dawson Street, now long gone, sadly. And my mother sent me in to buy the last Richard Wagner's last songs from Tune, written about 1948, 49. And he'd take the records out. I mean, he'd take this thing out of my bag and look at it and examine the design and the da and the da and the da. And then I think I told you that one of the records I brought in one evening, he wanted to play it, and he had a little blue portable gramophone so he took it out and he conducted it. And Lucy Charles, who was professor of design, eventually came in her very patient, smiley way. He wasn't going to pay any attention to it. He said, I'm not finished. And he went on conducting. It was fantastic.
Oh, wow.
And then he looked at the other students and he said, have any of you got good records? And this unfortunate girl said, yeah, this, and it was a pop record called Sweet for My Sweet, Honey for My Honey. And Fergus, I thought. And then he said, show me. And he took it away from her and he looked at the cover, and he knew the person who designed the cover.
Okay.
And so he was very funny about things, and he liked certain wines and not other wines. And one time in Ranslow and Connolly's, anyway, George and the others were going on about some particular wine, and Fergus came in and he said, what are you talking about? And they said about the wines, and my father said, time for us to go. And Fergus said, what wine? And they said, whatever. He said, that's just peasant's piss. He said, what are you doing? There was a certain silence in the pub that night.
That was George Campbell that he was talking. Yeah.
And he looked at my father and said, all right, Morris. And my father said, well, I don't drink Spanish wines. So that got him out of it. But he had this extraordinary drive and energy and interest in what he was doing. And if you look at his paintings, particularly the sequences of the city ones, let's say, or even looking at small towns, he had a great sense of, you're quite right about the place, but also about What do I mean? I mean the structure of the buildings and, you know, the upright spires and all the rest of it.
Yes.
He didn't find the gloomy spires of Fermanagh and Enniskillen gloomy at all. He loved anything like that because it gave him a physical focus.
Yeah, and that was something that struck me, was that he was, you know, he's not an architectural painter per se, but yet he had a fantastic ability to capture the, you know, the bulk, the structure of, you know, these wonderful churches in Venice and the Irish College in Salamanca, but yet there isn't a sense of them being that, even though very often the building is the focus of the picture, you don't have a sense of it being an architectural study. It just happened to, like, we've just stumbled upon this scene and there it is in all its glory. And he has a very easy style of painting buildings. And as you say, the things like towers and spires come very easily to him, but also very capably done.
He also had been, as you know, he won the poster, the stamp rather design from Chustel in, whenever was that, 53? And he was also a designer of posters. And you can see a lot of his technique when you're looking at those, particularly city scenes, when you're looking through trees at houses and fields, or houses and gardens. And he used those as the way in for your eye to go in through those to find what was in behind. He liked people to follow a little trail. And that's why he also liked places like, you know, Avondale and Wicklow and things, because there were so many trees, and the light coming through the trees and the different times of the years intrigued him. And he had a very nice touch for a lot of those, and rivers and movement like that. And not always easy to paint rivers.
Yeah.
It really isn't. It's harder than people think when you look at them.
Absolutely.
And he had a great sense, and he enjoyed what he was doing. And I think a lot of people will enjoy rejoining his work.
Yes.
You know, 1980, 40 years, 50 years ago, whatever it is. You know, people will enjoy them, and they should enjoy them, because they're domestic things that are there to be enjoyed.
Yeah.
And he enjoyed it. And he lived beside Tom Nesbitt in Bird Avenue.
Yeah.
And they had a very jolly time, I think. Well, I know they had a very jolly time. And Tom was very witty as well.
Yeah.
And so between them all, they had their own little group, and he did what he wanted to do. And he led the life that he wanted to lead. Do you know, it was...
And in terms of his... he was a Royal Academician, Royal Hibernian Academician, but he was also involved in the sort of administration, at least to some degree, in relation to the annual exhibitions. That he was he one of the...
He was a senior member, and he was one of the on the hanging committee, which meant they controlled the committee which made the selections. It was always composed of, say, the officers of the academy, some senior members, and then some junior members. And you have a great photograph, I think, of himself and Muriel Brandt looking at something. She's looking at it with disbelief, and he obviously is laughing at it and not with it. But he was like that. And that's what I said about the moustache too. It kind of wandered around his face, and you'd know what he was thinking. But he was good. And with the hanging, and some of the others like Des Carrick and some of the others, and Henry Healy, neither of whom we particularly liked, but worked well with him. And they got the exhibition. They're huge exhibitions, you know, like 160 paintings and all these sculptures and stuff.
Yeah.
And
a lot
he
of
threw himself. And he was also involved with the Watercolour Society and the Dublin Painters. So if he was going to do something, he did it. He did it wholeheartedly. If he was going to do it, if he couldn't do it, he'd bring my father up and say, "Listen, Mac, I actually can't do it for whatever reason."
Yeah.
And my father would unhesitatingly say, "Fine, I'm sorry about that," because my father found him a very great bulwark against other kinds of troubles. And you could say to him, "What do you think, Fergus?" And he'd give you his opinion. He and my father, I mean, I can't say they were close friends, because that would be untrue, but they were friends. And my father valued him. and he was very great company, and he was very clever, and as I say, absolutely also a person who said if you're going to do something, it got done.
Yeah, yeah. Which, when it comes to a sort of a group of artists trying to organize a sort of an exhibition of that size and caliber, it certainly requires somebody with that kind of focus.
There could be very great tensions.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And on when they were laying out the pictures and people trying to push their friends to one position or another, and my father would walk around, say absolutely nothing, maybe just kick something into place and say to somebody, do you really want to hang it there, kind of thing, and leave, and then come back later on, and then there'd be furious phone calls, and then at home to my mother, and then my mother would say to my father, now, Morris, you got it. Now, Morris, you got it. And she'd do this little finger. You got to do it. Yeah. And so it was sometimes the solution was to have them all around for a bowl of soup or a drink or something.
Right.
And other times there were more draconian measures required. Right. But by and large, they got along, and he got along with people like James White, which it wasn't anywhere near anything he liked. And he'd known, you see, as my father had known people like, well, not as long as my father, obviously, Norah McGuinness, since they were, very young.
Yes.
And he was very tolerant of a lot of them. And he liked certain Irish artists' work that one didn't necessarily think he would. And he could admire the structure and I'm trying to find the right word, the purpose of, say, why somebody would do an abstract piece. He'd say, yeah, it's not for me, but I understand what they're doing. And he was good like that. He could see things,
Sorry to interrupt you, but just on that particular topic, because there's a couple of pictures in the sale that show his sort of slight experimentation with cubism. And remind me a little bit of George Campbell, but also there's one or two that have a sort of a Mary Swansea sort of feel to them. So as could well have been that he was influenced by them, or they were both seeing the landscape in a similar fashion.
He certainly liked the work of Mary Swansea. He often spoke about it.
Right.
And when Leo, after the war, and Dermot O'Brien, just at the end of the war, arranged to bring her work over for the RHA because it had been stored in London, although she was, I think, still living out in Coolock or wherever her brother-in-law was living. And they saw to it that, her work got a good showing, and they liked her work. He was a good deal more cautious about Leach, say.
Okay.
Never understood that, but he was very, very, very au fond about Mary Swansea, and thought her a very inventive and original painter.
Right.
So who knows? Artists like some artists, and artists also often like artists quite unlike themselves for obvious reasons of mental protection and everything else.
Yeah.
But he was good about it, and he was generous in his sense of the hanging of exhibitions. He wouldn't try and just push people because they're either friends or there's something that suited him. He saw the wider picture. And I remember he kind of retired, I think, and remember one day I was pouncing around the National Gallery being very grand about something, and he came in and he said, there he is, come over here and tell me about this picture, some new picture that either James or Holman had bought, and I would tell him about it. And he'd look at me and he'd say, do you believe that? Sometimes you might be put to the pin of your collar. It would lack verisimilitude. But he at the same time, he'd laugh. He wouldn't hold it against you,
Right.
But he did I'm conscious that he liked Mary Swansea. I think something to do, I'll put it like this to you, it's a peculiar explanation maybe, because she wandered the highways and byways of the south of France, and the Côte d'Azur and places, that wandering appealed to him.
Yes, it
And
would. Obviously, yeah.
little roads, if you look at some of her work on the little roads, the little lanes and things,
Yeah,
he liked that. He
yeah.
liked that very much.
It
It
wasn't.
really,
It wasn't the obvious placement.
no, no. And her literal physical perspective on some of the scenes, you know, the way they look down and the
Yeah,
odd shapes of things. He liked that oddity. And he said to me about lino prints and things, he said she would have been a very good graphic maker, you know,
okay.
of scenes. And you
Yeah,
could see the sense of what he was talking about.
yeah, sure. Because you can
Does that
actually
make sense
see,
to you?
you can see that in her, you know, those wonderful little drawings that she did in colored pencils,
Hmm,
you know, which
hmm,
aren't a million miles away from, you know, as you've
hmm,
referred to there, doing something in a sort of a graphic
hmm,
form. Uh,
hmm.
but yes, I can understand exactly what he was thinking. Um,
But she could do and because she could do slight touches, you know, with her drawing,
yeah,
those little books you're talking about and the reflections and things.
yeah,
Um, it did something to him. It touched something else that he could see maybe that he hadn't always got to go the full, you know,
yes,
4 courses to get
yeah,
there. Do you know?
yeah, yeah. Well, I think that we, having come through over a year now of being sort of restricted in our movements, and the theme of this auction is travels, and it's called Travels, Painter and Palette, which I think aptly describes, you know, the theme
Hmm.
which brings these 217 pictures all together. But it also, I think, engenders in a lot of us that sort of desire to get away again. And he actually captures that lovely sense of, you know, relaxed holidays, trucking, you know, across the mountains, which are gear, and doing all the things that we absolutely can't wait to get to do again. And we will get to do it again. But in the meantime, here's an opportunity to, you know, buy a picture or pictures which are, as we've said, you know, very agreeable, um, always, you know, perpetually popular, and are going to be at, you know, I mean, most of the estimates are in the hundreds,
Hmm.
and it's an unreserved sale, so there's not going to be
Hmm.
any reserves. So it's going to be
Hmm.
there for people, and also the lovely benefit then going of the proceeds being so generously donated to
The
the Our
hospital.
Lady's Hospice. So it'll be an all-round win-win, I think.
You are right in the sense, particularly about the business about our restlessness at the moment. Now that the dawning day may be approaching,
Yes.
and that people can suddenly they can look at something from Venice or from Santorini or wherever and say, yeah, and now I'm going to buy that and I'm going to go back and see that, you know,
Yeah.
that kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
And that's one of the values of painters of landscape and landscape scenes of that sort, because it reminds people, in fact, what's there and the glories of Europe
Yes.
and Greece. You know that.
Absolutely. And on our doorstep as well.
I remember once we was talking about having been, I was telling him I'd been to Ithaca, and it was the great poem about the blood red sea. And I said, but you have to see it in the evening as the sun sinks. And he said something like, I haven't seen that. And he put his head down and he looked up and he said, but I will now, because it's such an extra, the sun literally dies.
Yes.
And as it dies, the whole sea is flooded with this light, which it turns red.
Yeah.
And he said, that's what I'm going to do. And he did at the end, I think.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they
Fantastic.
are remarkable. Thank you for that exhibition, James. It's
Not
a
at
good
all. And
reminder.
Ciaran, thank you so much for giving me your time, but also for the lovely memoir of your experience with Fergus, which we've published in the catalogue. And I should just mention that the catalogue is not being printed. It's a totally online on our website
Hmm.
on
It looks very good. I looked at it last
www.adams.ie.
night. Yeah,
Sorry?
I looked at it last night. It looks very good. I looked at it last
Yeah,
night.
yeah, absolutely.
And when I reread my words, and sometimes you reread your own words and your heart sinks. My heart didn't sink. I was
Great.
glad that I had described him like that. And I think,
Yeah.
I hope even people like you who didn't know him regard it as a fair account of a man and his work.
Well, I've definitely now, between reading what you've written for us and having had this conversation, have a much better idea about the man and the artist. And thank you so much for sort of filling in so many of the gaps. And we will look forward to a successful sale, hopefully. As I say, it's online and it'll happen on the 21st of April. So there's still a number of days left to get involved. So it can all be done on our website on adams.ie. So Ciaran MacGonigal, thank you so much, and look forward to seeing you in person, hopefully sometime soon.
Quite. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Ciaran.
Not at all.